Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Price Formation Enhancements Working Group session. Today is session 11. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs. I'm joined today by our facilitator, Juan Vitrago, from our Stakeholder Engagement Group here at the ISO, as well as James Friedrich from the policy team here at the ISO. Before we get started, I just want to go through a couple of housekeeping reminders. So the call today is being recorded. The recording is for informational and convenience purposes only. So any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. These collaborative working groups are intended to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives. And while we welcome your comments and feedback, just a reminder to please keep those professional and respectful. And then as we go through the conversation today, the ISO encourages any verbal or written agreements to the comments made during this working group session. So please feel free to jump in and agree or provide additional comments when we stop for Q&A. So there were some recent changes to the web conferencing platform, specifically around audio while joining meetings. So you may have noticed that the Call Me feature is no longer being offered when you join into our meetings. And now you must choose between the computer audio option or a dial-in option. Those dial-in option details are provided in the meeting details upon your pre-registration. And we are actively working with Inteller on alternative options, so we appreciate your patience while we work through this transition. If you do have a question or comment today and you connected to the computer audio, you can raise your hand by selecting the raise hand icon, which is located at the bottom of your screen. If you dialed into the meeting on the phone only line, you'll need to press #2 to raise your hand. And then just a reminder for everyone on the line, please remember to state your name and affiliation before making your comment or asking your question today. And then you can also send your question or comment through the chat to all panelists. So we'll be monitoring that today as well. As far as today's agenda goes, in just a second, I'm going to hand things over to our facilitator, Juan, to go over the goals for today and any information on next sessions. And then we'll hear from James Friedrich on the Sprint 2 scarcity pricing problem statement. And then we'll turn things back over to Juan for some stakeholder discussion on the scarcity pricing topic. And then we'll wrap up today with some next steps. And before I go any further, just a reminder that these slides are available out on the Price Formation the Price Formation Initiative webpage on the ISO website. And you can get to that page by going to priso.com. You'll click on the Stay Informed tab. Under that tab, you'll see policy initiatives listed. That will take you out to our main initiative landing page where you can find the Price Formation Enhancements initiative page, and then these slides should be one of the very first items posted there on that web page. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Juan and we'll get started.
Okay. Thank you, Isabella. Appreciate it. And to the stakeholder community, appreciate you guys joining us for what we're calling Sprint 2. I know we're doing very kind of rapid succession meetings here. So great engagement last week. Really want to thank everybody for sharing their thoughts and really putting that out for the community to be able to kind of riff on and comment back, right? I think we had several instances of some really good back and forth amongst the stakeholder community, and that's really something that we're intending to foster in these working groups. Selena, I see your hand went up. I'm going to go through the goals. Oh, okay, might have been an accidental one. So again, last week, we had great engagement, a very robust discussion. We ran right up on time. So you guys may have noticed that we did extend this to go through noon. So we have a little bit more time. And while we are going to be focusing a little bit more on a problem statement that centers kind of right of the line of the graphic that we've been using to kind of show that delineation of scarce conditions, we do want to give a little bit of time to review what we discussed last week and open it back up to the stakeholder community for any additional comments on the demand curve that we were discussing at the last session when we kind of ran out of time. So that's the goal for today, is really to focus in on the second problem statement. Again, you can see these slides posted on the Price Formation Enhancements Initiative page, but we will be carving out very intentionally, making sure that we have some time to continue that discussion from last week. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, please. So as you can see, this is where we are on the stakeholder policy initiative process. This working group is meant to kind of inform where we want to move forward in policy development. We appreciate y'all's engagement and participation throughout here. So stay tuned. We should have updates on how this might feed into that policy development here shortly. So let's go ahead and move over to the next slide. With that, I will hand the floor off to James Friedrich to provide a little bit of a staff presentation centered around the second problem statement. So James, let's take it away with the review of last week, and then we can dive into the meat of sprint number 2. The floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Juan. So as Juan alluded, we will do a little review of last week, and recognizing that we sort of ran close on time, we'll have another opportunity for stakeholders to sort of reflect on the conversation last week, and hopefully these slides can give you a gentle reminder of what we talked about. And if you have anything to share or any questions or comments that didn't get the chance to ask last time, or are sort of newly or fresh in your mind, we'll take a pause after the section to see if there are any questions or comments, and then we will proceed with the sprint number 2 topic and get right into that. So a few slides of review here. The concept of scarcity pricing. Last week we talked about how it's quite normal for when demand on the system to increase, that prices will naturally rise as the market is looking to commit and dispatch more and more expensive generators as the demand increases, and those sort of price effects are quite normal and not exactly what we mean by scarcity pricing. Scarcity pricing means something specific when the market is enabling prices to rise above the highest offer price of an available resource due to a shortfall in meeting demand. So we talked about last week that normally the marginal cost of production, which is a sort of a supply side input, tends to clear the price under normal operating conditions. But in the case where you don't have enough supply offers to meet a demand of a certain product, sorry, I got a little echo there. Okay, so if you're not able to meet the demand of a certain product, then there is no sort of quote unquote marginal generator in that case. And so there's not able to use the supply side input to set the market price. And so predetermined penalty prices are used to establish sort of the demand side function of willingness to pay, because demand is not actively bidding and participating in the real-time market. And so those penalty prices attempt to approximate what the willingness to pay for certain market products are. Now, in specific to the ancillary services market, the CAISO uses a scarcity reserve demand curve. That's our SRDC. That's a term we talked about a lot last week. That's a tariff-defined term, and it's in the BPM. You can find the tables of the values and steps for those in the tariff and the BPM. And during periods of supply shortfalls to clear the various ancillary service targets, as I mentioned, we use administratively determined penalty prices to set the market price for those products when there's not enough offers to procure it through the market. So the scarcity reserve demand curve has been around since 2010. It's a mechanism aimed to increase supply and decrease demand during tight system conditions. And the price the price signal that the scarcity reserve demand curve sets is vitally important to encouraging market participants to behave in a certain way that doesn't exacerbate system conditions during that time. All right, next slide, please. So last week, our discussion reflected on CAISO's market design features that limit the activation of the scarcity reserve demand curve under tight system conditions. And that centered around the fact that one, ancillary services are not fully reprocured in the real-time market. And so that prevents the market from being able to totally reconsider the mix of energy and ancillary service schedules that are coming out of the day-ahead market, and sort of limits the opportunity for the scarcity reserve demand curve to bind when it otherwise may be appropriate. And we've talked about we talked about some potential improvements. Again, these are when we talk about anything resembling a solution in this working group, it's just to generate discussion. These are not proposals, but it does help to sort of put some things forward to get people's minds working about, you know, what might be done to address certain problems. We talked about things like a stronger deliverability tests for ancillary service procurement that can enable complete reoptimization of ancillary services in the real-time market, and can do that both in RTPD, which is the 15-minute market, and in RTD, which is the 5-minute market. And so we talked about last week that full ancillary service reprocurement it may be desirable for many reasons beyond just scarcity pricing, but you know, it's been made clear from our operations team that they would be not comfortable with that sort of market design change without a complementary change to have a stronger deliverability test for those AS requirements, because there's a lot of work that goes into ensuring that the AS products are as deliverable as they can be coming out of the day-ahead market into the real-time market. And if there was no change in the deliverability test of those AS products, and you were to completely re-optimize the AS in the real-time market without any stronger assurance of deliverability than you get today, then it sort of unwinds all of the hard work that the operations team has done in trying to ensure deliverability of those reserves, and gives them very, very limited amounts of time to reconcile that in real time. So we talked about, we kind of jammed that in at the end. There wasn't a whole lot of time to sit and think on that, but that's something we talked about last week. And then again, in review, last week's discussion was centered around the market's response to an actual shortage. So the scarcity reserve demand curve applies scarcity pricing in conditions where the market cannot meet one of the required AS targets. And while that's important, it's only sort of a partial part of the story, which we'll get into this week, which are there actions the market could or should be taking in advance of the shortage conditions to encourage or enable a price response in the energy and AS market to get market participants to behave in a way in advance of the shortage to either avoid the shortage in the first place or to reduce the impact of that. So that's sort of where the distinction between last week's discussion and this week's discussion take place. Quick pause there. Okay, so we'll go on to the next slide. Actually, if we can go back to slide 10, I'm going to make one more announcement that, again, acknowledging that last week's discussion on this topic was a little bit crammed near the end. I will take this time to remind folks that if you do have a comment or question related to last week's material, anything you want to discuss, this would be the time to do it, because otherwise on slide 11, the next slide, we will transition to a new topic. So I'll pause there and wait for any questions or comments in the queue.
Thanks, James. Yeah, and again, we appreciate that very engaged discussion last week, and we're looking to continue it, and that's why we extended this particular session by an hour. So I see we have Robert Fisher's hand up. My producer, could we go ahead and unmute Robert?
Robert Fisher with MBE. Can you confirm you can hear me?
We can hear you, Robert.
Thank you. Just a quick comment in regards to last week's discussion. I was reflecting upon it, and I realized there wasn't much discussion in regards to flex ramp pricing being kind of a triggering point in regards to scarcity pricing. In the July pricing performance paper, they emphasized that the resources were not being dispatched because of the cost of the bids, which could also really lead to relaxation. So I was kind of surprised that that topic kind of has been left out. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, so we'll talk about flexible ramping product and how it fits into the overall scarcity pricing topic in today's sprint. I tried to distinguish, let me just reflect a little bit on how I tried to distinguish the two topics. So in last week's discussion was specific to the scarcity reserve demand curve, which is a tariff-defined term to discuss penalty prices that happen when you relax one of the ancillary service products, of which flexible ramping product has a different sort of methodology in terms of its demand curve relaxation. So yeah, this week we'll talk about flexible ramping product and how that fits in. Thanks, Robert.
Thanks, Robert. Any additional comments on the last week's discussion, or is everybody ready to dive into right of the line or impending scarcity? Okay. James, no additional comments or questions right now. Why don't we go ahead and move on in the presentation?
All right, great. So this, I just want to mention that the team has took the time. This is the figure that we've been showing in every scarcity pricing working group session, but this is actually an adaptation of the figure that we have been presenting, and I just want to highlight a couple of changes that we made. First is that we used to have a disclaimer on this line that showed the CAISO's reserve shortage pricing relative to a $1,000 bid cap. And we had a disclaimer to say, well, under most of the time when we're in tight system conditions, we've activated sort of FERC Order 831 conditions, which enable the bid cap and the penalty prices as well to scale up to a $2,000 level, and to say, you know, hopefully that's not misleading. So in an attempt to sort of make it more clear where the CAISO fits within the overall scope of other markets in terms of reserve shortage pricing, we've the authors of the paper cited below were kind enough to help us rectify that. And so this now positions the CAISO in such a way where we're assuming that the reserve shortage pricing is a reflection of CAISO under a $2,000 bid cap and penalty prices. So I'll just mention that impact, it may be a little hard to make out, but on the left side of the red line, where the red line again being the point where we move from sort of the NERC required minimum reserves on the left of the line to you know, some of the additional reserves that are held for either economic or reliability reasons on the right of the line. The five curves, there's 5 steps to the scarcity reserve demand curve, which make up the left of the line, and all of those have been doubled in penalty price. One thing to note that the flexible ramping product demand curve, which is represented you look near the bottom of the screen, in between 3 and 4 available reserves, you can see a downward sloping yellow line. That represents the flexible ramping product demand curve. The flexible ramping product demand curve does not scale under FERC Order 831 conditions. So its relative values to the chart you're used to seeing has not changed. All that's changed is the 5 steps on the left of the red line. So we're going to focus, as we sort of alluded to, we're going to sort of focus today's discussion on elements of reserve shortage pricing that are on the right of this line, which are reserve products held by the ISOs that are sort of in addition to the sort of required reserves. Just visually, one thing to note is there's a couple of things. One is sort of the height of these lines. Obviously, ERCOT, if you're focusing on the right-hand side of the red line, ERCOT being a little bit of an outlier in this case. But you have ISO New England, PJM. I got to make the brightness on my screen higher so I can make out these colors. ISO New England, PJM, and New York ISO, who both are have higher values, but also have more reserves procured relative to the CAISO, which is the bold yellow line, also SPP, which is the green line. It is a little hard to see, but actually MISO, which is like the hardest line to see on this chart, MISO actually does have relatively low values in terms of dollar value, but the amount of reserves they procure, it actually intersects with 5 gigawatts instead of 4. It's just that there's a reserve product that they have in their market that has a penalty price of like $5 or something like that. So it's really, really close to the 0 on the y-axis there. So it's a little bit hard to see. Maybe in the future, when presenting the slide focused on the right-hand side, I can sort of zoom in on this sort of cluster of reserve products here to make it a little more obvious where everybody fits. But we're going to talk today about, you know, sort of what's on the right-hand side of the line for a lot of these ISOs. And if when we talk about our problem statement, this visual is a helpful reference to sort of see, you know, if you're a visual learner, what it means to accomplish our problem statement today. So I'll pause here to see if there's any questions or comments, clarifications on this slide.
James, I'm not seeing any hands or any comments. Again, if you are in the phone only or dial-in line, just hit #2 to have your hand raised. Okay, so James, we do have a comment in the chat. I'll read it out to you as I think you're presenting here. One thing I noticed about this chart was that in the gigawatts, instead of some standard in relation to the size of the market, this chart may also be more meaningful when shown as a percentage of the system peak or some other metric that scales them appropriately. James, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about that normalization, maybe applicability of that comment?
Yeah, it's a good observation, and somebody made a similar observation last week to say, well, the numbers on the x-axis seem maybe potentially misleading because different markets have different footprints. For example, the ISO New England market is much smaller than ERCOT's market. So how are these reserves to be interpreted? So the answer is that these are normalized by size, and the best way I can explain how to interpret the x-axis of the chart is that the actual quantity of reserves doesn't really matter in this context. So for example, let's pick on the CAISO for a second. So in the CAISO, this yellow line here at $2,000, the first line on the left is representative of the reg up penalty price of the scarcity reserve demand curve. The $2,000 price level is accurate, but if you were to draw a vertical line down, it would show it intersecting at about 500 megawatts of reserves. So what the authors are basically trying to do is to put these charts on a line in order to compare them as best as possible, recognizing the different size of the market footprints and the various quantities of reserves that they hold in a way that you can make something like this visually comparable. So the only thing related to the x-axis that's really valuable in my mind for this discussion is the red line. Again, anything on the left of the red line represents steps of some sort of reserve demand curve that are on reserves that are required essentially in order to, these are reserves that you would hold on to ahead of energy at any given time because they're required for reliability. Now, anything on the right-hand side are sort of optional reserves, like flexible ramping product, for example, is on the right-hand side. It's not a NERC required ancillary service, but we do have that reserve product for various economic and reliability reasons, and similar to other markets that have sort of additional reserves that they'll hold. So that's the best way to sort of think about the x-axis on the slide, is to focus in on what's left of the red line and what's right of the red line. I hope that helped.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and thank you, James. And so, Sybil, if you have, yep, nope, I think that answered the question. James, we have a couple of hands up here. Let's go to JK first, please.
Good morning, James, Juan. James, I have this is JK from PG&E. I have a quick question. Did you just mention how the red line is defined is basically what's on the right-hand side is not within the NERC requirement? Is that what you just said?
That's correct.
Okay, so basically the portion on the right-hand side of this is, can we interpret it as an anticipation of a shortage coming up?
Exactly.
Okay. Yep. Does that also depends on how much margin each of the market?
Please press 1 to continue and become the host, or press 2 to cancel the request.
Sorry, I'm not sure if that's coming from me, but it seems there's a narration coming for me to change the. Do you still hear me?
We can hear you now. We lost you on whether or not this depended on how much margin.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was asking, does it depend on how much reliability margin each market put on for the requirement of reserves? Because let me elaborate a little bit. So if the 3 gigawatts were normalized, the 3 gigawatts is what for the NERC's requirement, and the red line kicks in when we start to relax our requirement, whatever about that requirement, isn't that the margin, whatever, maybe there's a term to call that, each market want to procure. Does that make sense?
Could you, yeah, maybe ask it in a different way, because I'm not following right now.
Yeah, so the 3 gigawatt is the NERC requirement for the reserves, right? And right. The apparently, like the market, let's for example, CAISO could procure above 3 gigawatts, and for example, it can procure 5 gigawatts or 4 gigawatts. But the thing is, you started to relax that there's a amount above the procurement requirement that will be the reliability margin defined by each of the market and not required by FERC, right? So in another way,
I think I'm following you now.
Yeah, if a greater margin the market has set, and apparently they could be different. I don't know if there's a standard or not. Maybe some expert can chime in. But if the market happens to define a greater margin, you will of course have the curve cover a greater distance. But if the margin have to be relatively small, then of course you won't have a curve that covers a greater amount.
Yeah, so I get what you're saying. So you're saying that essentially there's some quantity above in excess of the NERC requirement that you could buy, and the
Right.
larger that quantity is, the more, I guess, opportunity that you would have to sort of economically relax the requirements in advance of sort of getting to those NERC requirements. Is that essentially what you're saying?
I think you just extended what I just said. I think that's a, that's a good way of thinking of this. I was just stating the fact in terms of, why you will have a range that extending the, beyond the red line. I was thinking, if that's a margin or something, and the plot of the curve would depends on the margin. But what do you just say?
Please press
What do
1
you
to
just
continue and become the host, or press 2 to cancel the request.
Sorry, it seems I was cut off briefly. But yeah, it seems that the
Three products make up the 5 line, or the 5 curves on the left of the line. And the way that this curve is illustrated shows we don't, for those 3 reserve products, we don't buy more than the margin in the market. Whether or not that's a good thing is debatable. But right now, there is no sort of economic consideration about the value of reserves relative to the quantity of those 3 products. Now, for flexible ramping product, which is, you can see, is that downward sloping line, you do have, this represents a reserve product that the real-time market procures that is sort of above what you need to hold for NERC requirements, that you can make, the market does make an economic trade-off of holding the reserve relative to the cost. And one principle that we should discuss is, all else equal, the more reserves the market is holding, the more reliable. That says nothing of the cost of doing that, of course, but all else equal, the more reserve the market holds, the more reliable, because you're going to have, be able to move among a wide range of system conditions to anticipate. Now, of course, there's cost to holding reserves because you can't dispatch those reserves for energy or other services that you need. And so the whole idea of this chart is, the reason why it's sort of downward sloping from left to right is to recognize that, okay, well, as you get more and more scarce, as your margin decreases, the cost of doing so in terms of the reliability of holding that reserves sort of goes up as your margin decreases. And so what the problem statement today is going to discuss is whether or not the California ISO's market is positioned, and actually we should say that broadly, that's the EIM in this case, is the EIM and the California ISO's market positioned in such a way to have a sufficient margin to get this price response in advance of the red line. And I think that by illustrating the position of the CAISO relative to the other markets helps to show, where we fit within what other markets are doing. JK, let me know what your reaction is to that.
I think that's a fair statement, and I think you just you said it very well. It's not just the shape of the curves that matters, but also how the market is designed. And the point is just to look not just at the curves, but to the market behind it, because a lot of people paying attention to what is the axis means, but the x-axis not only means the shape of the curve, but also means how the market is designed, how much margin we actually procured. Yeah, so thank you very much for saying that well.
Yeah, so in terms of margin, I'll just close out that thought. If you want to define margin as we'll define margin as how far right of the red line does the market procure reserves. And so you might think of ISO New England in light blue, New York ISO in purple, PJM in pink, and then again, it's hard to see, MISO is in brown. Technically, all of those areas on this normalized chart are buying more reserves in real time relative to the CAISO. And SPP is also, and SPP and CAISO sort of overlap in that regard. But is it desirable potentially to increase our margin relative to some sort of economic trade-off that some of the other markets are doing? Is kind of what the discussion's about today.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Great question,
Thank you.
JK. Let's go ahead and move to Callie, please. Okay, Callie, your line is unmuted.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. Can you hear me okay?
We can. You're a little bit faint, but we can hear you.
Okay, I'll talk louder to the microphone. Quick question on this curve. So I know you guys adjusted the yellow curve. Sorry, I should have specified that. Based on the FERC Order 831 conditions. So when the power balance is set at 2000, we see this demand curve go up. And I get that, but it's not necessarily a 1-for-1, right? You can have the operating reserve demand curve kick in even outside of FERC Order 831 conditions. And in that case, the yellow line here would actually be down to the $1,000, hitting at the $1,000 point there on the y-axis, like you showed it, I think, last week. Do we have a sense of how often the scarcity pricing kicked in under FERC Order 831 conditions versus when the power balance constraint was set at 1,000?
Yeah, that's a great comment. So historically, so you could look at the best way to reference would be in the price formation stakeholder page. I don't remember if it was working group 8 maybe. We linked to the 2020 through 2022 Ancillary Service Scarcity Report, which is a report that the ISO is required by FERC to publish. And what you find in there is that if you were to look at like a year like 2020, where we had a lot of AS scarcity events, well, relatively many AS scarcity events to other years. And you had some of those events happened because of just general system scarcity, in which case you would expect that 2020 was pre-FERC Order 831 implementation, but you would expect that under those times, you're pretty likely to be in $2,000 penalty prices, which is why we sort of felt like it was, it's not a perfect one-to-one, as you say, but we felt like it was stronger to suggest that this is the more representative way of looking at the penalty prices as it relates to scarcity pricing than to have it the other way around. But what you also find in that report is that sometimes AF scarcity pricing kicks in because of just a shortage of bids and not at all because of system scarcity. Because you could have things like, imagine a really large unit is getting a lot of non-spin from the ISM, and then that resource in the real-time market goes on outage. And, all of a sudden the real-time market has to re-procure AS in that, and they might not be able to resolve the requirement. So it would be that would be an example of the scarcity reserve demand curve kicking in even when you're not in quote unquote scarcity conditions. It can just be because our resources are unavailable that we're providing spin. And so that report does document like the various reasons why the AF scarcity curve was triggered. And I want to say like something like 75% of the time during the year 2020, it was not necessarily because of a system scarcity event, but because of something else. So I sort of get what you're saying, but in terms of scarcity pricing, we think that if the AF reserve pricing is going to kick in during times of system scarcity, we're more likely to be in $2,000 conditions than on $1,000 conditions. But I'm open to hearing if maybe what we could do is we could add like a dashed yellow line for the old line to say like, okay, here's the FERC Order 831 line and here's the non-FERC Order 831 line. I don't know, would something like that be more useful to you, Callie, or?
I'm not asking you to, you don't have to modify this slide again and add in that dash yellow line. I guess I'm trying to get a sense of post FERC Order 831, how many times did scarcity conditions kick in when the price is at 2000 and we would see AS scarcity prices based off of this yellow line versus when it was at 1000 and we'd see AS scarcity prices based on the prior version's yellow line. I think that's really useful information and data to have on hand, especially because I get theoretically you would maybe assume that when we're in tight supply conditions, we would be at the $2,000 bid cap and price or in power balance constraint penalty price anyways, but that's not necessarily always going to be the case. And if we're talking complete holistic reform of scarcity pricing, I think it's really important that we have that information because you're going to want to send consistent signals, I would think. And so it would be unfortunate, you know, in my mind to move forward and then realize that, you know, move forward with the conversations under the assumption that when AS scarcity pricing kicks in, we're looking at this yellow line in all cases. So I'm just asking if maybe you guys could provide that data, maybe at the next working group next week, if it's not too hard to pull or at some point, so we can see what that distribution looks like or that breakdown looks like. Because if it is the case, then maybe that is a reasonable assumption. But if it's 50-50 and half the time when we're hitting this demand curve, the highest price is 1000 and the other half it's 2000, then, you know, that might open up additional conversations. So I guess I'm just asking more for the data to help support the conversation going forward.
Yeah, it's a fair comment, and I can tell you that my hunch is that that sort of data would be less informative than you might think, in the sense that one, FERC Order 831 condition implementation is not that old, so our sample isn't very big. But summer 2022, for example, and we talked about this in this working group, we had there were 5 straight days of, I think it was 4 or 5 straight days of EEA2 or higher. And we talked about the AS scarcity reserve demand curve never kicked in during summer of 2022. And so you would expect in a perfect world that if you were in scarcity conditions, both of those things were to be true. But there have been sort of these limitations, I guess, in a way where in the past year or two, and maybe summer 2023 is a good one to look at as well, that the overlap isn't maybe as strong as it should be. And I'm using should as like, I'm making a normative statement here, compared to the way it has been. So I think it's something that we're trying to sort of reconcile, is like, is the scarcity reserve demand curve kicking in the times it should? And that would help when you look at the data to say, oh, more often when you're in FERC Order 831 conditions is the scarcity reserve demand curve activating. So I hope that context helps a little bit. That sort of data may not be a perfect representation of what we're trying to.
Oh, I'm not sure if it's your audio that just dropped or mine.
I think we lost your audio.
James, yeah.
All right, I don't mean to belabor this. I think that information.
And Callie, I think. Oh, yep. James, you're back on. Go ahead.
Okay. Sorry, that was a long answer, but how much did you catch?
Not much, and that's okay. I didn't mean to belabor this conversation. I think that information would actually be useful, especially if we're talking price formation under scarcity conditions. And if it's maybe something we need to look at changing down the road, I think that information would be useful, because without that information, without making, explicit changes, if that's the direction we want to go, we could end up in situations down the road where this demand curve is kicking in and we're at 1,000 instead of the expected 2,000 maybe, based on all these conversations. So I'll leave it at that. I think that data would be useful, and at least to keep that in mind as we're continuing down these conversations, is that it is not a 1-for-1. I don't know what that overlap is, but I think it would be useful to know.
Thanks, Callie. And we'll take that back and look internally to see, what it would be to pull that data. So we appreciate that request. I apologize.
Yeah.
Go here, guys.
Take up that much time on that question, so I apologize. Thanks. It's just a simple data request.
Understood. Yeah, no, we appreciate that. Let us go back to the teams and see what we could do with that. So, JK, I see your hand back up, but I'm not sure if that's legacy from last time. Okay, there we go. Let's go ahead and move to Robert.
Hi, this is Robert Fisher with MV. I'll be quick so we can move on. I think I wanted to kind of clarify. I think this curve can be a little misleading in a way, because the priority to the left of that red line is energy. And I wanted to make sure that I'm thinking of this the right way, James, and you kind of hit on it with Callie. The price can always go to a power balance shortage and still maintain the AAS requirements, because from a reliability perspective, maintaining your AAS is a higher priority, which is also done through the penalty pricing. So the fact that it kind of appears that you're going to have a tiered pricing up to 2,000 could be a little misleading, because as you stated, if there's no physical outages like an OMS or any of the types of restrictions on a generation that will cut that, you could have power balance shortage all the way to the full quantity of the load forecast before it would even hit any of these AS penalty prices. Am I thinking about that the right way?
Yeah, so yes, I think you are. So there's some nuances, and we sort of talked about this as a team last week, that in the real-time market today, the ancillary service requirement, or the ancillary service scheduling priorities are lower than the power balance constraint in today. And I think that that may only be appropriate because the real-time market doesn't really reprocure the AS in full. And so what you could see is, like, if you were to keep those same penalty prices as they are today, and you were to fully reoptimize the AS, you could get into situations where all of a sudden, if energy is really expensive, the market's not procuring a large quantity of this AS, which, like, as you're pointing out, we need to hold on to these reserves. And so it sort of feels like to me that on the left side of the curve, there's sort of a two-pronged issue. One is that if we were to do something like full AS reoptimization in real time, are the current penalty prices in RTPD still, are the current scheduling priorities in RTPD valid, where you, meaning, as you're suggesting, do the AS reserves need to be moved to a higher priority than energy, in which case, how much would you actually see these sort of prices show up in the energy price if they're co-optimized? And the answer is only when you're not buying enough, you can't meet your reserve requirement. Yeah, I think I follow what you're saying, and it is a sort of a tough conundrum here.
Yeah, in RTPD, the penalty prices for the real time may be misleading, because the self schedules coming from day ahead have a penalty price that's almost 6 times the power balance constraint for the self schedules of those AS. So those penalty prices in real time may be misleading in regards to those priorities, because the self schedules on the day ahead awarded AS, it kind of confuses those points. But really my point is to the right of that line is really where your scarcity pricing is. Everything to the left of that, because of the reliability and of maintaining AS above energy, is the important aspect.
Yeah, those are good comments. Yeah, so you're right. So in the IFM procured AS is those are
Yep.
protected as
It's the same thing in real time. It's just communicated through the day ahead self schedules rather than the penalty prices that are used in real time.
Yeah, but the reason, yeah, so that's true. The only reason why it's relevant in this discussion is that if you were to fully open, if you were to not protect IFM AS awards as self-scheduled in RTPD, and instead open the AS and energy up to full reoptimization, what you're pointing out is that you're probably going to need to change the scheduling priority as well, because if you stick with the same scheduling priority as it's represented, here, you don't want to be in situations where you're prioritizing, not prioritizing these reserves that you need for reliability above energy.
Yeah, because if you're re-procuring it, you're still going to have you have to have a higher penalty or priority, excuse me, in regards to the reserves than energy, because that is the reliability operating, and I think it's the FERC rule. So I don't know if the re-optimization is really going to get you what you want as much. Thank you for the clarification.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, James, I do not see any other hands in queue here or questions in the chat. Floor is yours. Back to the presentation.
Thank you. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so here's the problem statement that we're discussing today. That the CAISO's market design limits the opportunity for energy prices to gradually rise ahead of impending demand shortfalls. So again, this is all on the right-hand side of the line, where you want it may be desirable to have mechanisms in place to have a price response in advance of the actual shortage conditions, as was mentioned a few times already today. So let's go to the next slide. So we've talked about many of these this week and last week and over the period of this working group. There's sort of 3 major market outcomes that are not optimal if this problem statement is not addressed. This one we talked about a lot last week, is that when you're in a shortage condition, it's too late. Scarcity pricing is too late. While you do still need the market to be able to resolve actual shortages through penalty prices, what you're trying to accomplish with scarcity pricing, as Robert just mentioned, is everything in advance of the shortage, because you need to have the price signal provide market participants sufficient time to respond and ultimately resolve the impending demand shortfall. And so if you don't have this sort of price feedback in the market, this could lead to an increased risk of reliability events, because market participants are not behaving in a way to incentivize them to respond to and resolve any impending demand shortfall. Number 2, there's a greater frequency of large and sudden energy price spikes. And so we didn't talk so much about this last week, but in previous working groups, we've discussed and shown some examples of tight system conditions with prices fluctuating really rapidly and largely between intervals. And what you're seeing is like the effect of big steps in penalty price, big jumps in penalty prices, creating big changes in market prices and big swings, instead of having gradual a gradual reflection of impending shortage on the market price. And why that's a problem is because these large and sudden price spikes create confusing price signals to participants, where if one interval you're sitting at $1,000 prices and then the next interval it goes down to 250, you're creating a signal to say, okay, well the reliability issues are resolving. But if the reliability issues are not in fact resolving, you've encouraged behavior that is opposite of what you're hoping for in terms of reliability. And so this is an increased risk to the market, possibly even an increased financial risk to certain participants, who, as we talked about last week, are preparing for actions to be taken during tight system conditions, such that they can be available for when the prices are likely to be highest. And if prices are swinging around, rapidly and in large magnitude, it could even create, some financial risk in terms of being in or out of the market during certain times. So having a more stable price signal is certainly a desirable outcome. And finally, the fact that system or energy and reserve prices are not gradually rising as well as they could be in anticipation of a shortage event ignores the fact that system operators behind the scenes are doing everything they can and essentially dispatching units, whatever they can do to take action that to resolve the impending shortage. And those actions may not be reflected in the market prices. And so essentially you're, if you have, actions that are being taken that are not reflective of prices, you have exacerbated the disconnect between the reliability condition and the price signal. And so to the extent that those things can be harmonized, leads to conditions that promote better grid reliability and more appropriate compensation for resources who are available and for demand participants as well. And demand, as we talked about last week, that can be demand response, that could be export, that could be batteries, any market participant that's putting a load on the system, is also incentivized to, not be consuming at those times. So I'll pause there to reflect on the problem statement on slide 12, and then these three market outcomes and that are suboptimal.
Okay, so let's open this up to any reactions or clarifying questions to this. So James, I am not seeing anything in the chat or any hands raised here. We'll toss it back to you.
All right, let's go to the next slide. So again, these are, the working group process is not intended to have a super deep dive on solutions, but these sort of things are the first things that, one would think about when, as JK said, increase your margin is another way of saying, we need to be able to provide sort of a greater pool of reserves to optimize with energy and get this price signal into the market in advance of what we're doing today. So there's a couple of different things to talk about, ways of doing that. And for each of these, I want to go back to the curve and sort of illustrate to you what this might look like. So number one is to extend the procurement curve of our non-required NERC reserve, which in this case is flexible ramping product. So if we go back to, I think it's slide 10 where the chart is on. Oh, slide 11. Thank you. Is basically to say, well, we do have a reserve that we're buying sort of in excess of the required minimum. Let's just buy more of it. more flexible ramping product, if you were to say, let's just say visually, were to move this curve that's now in between 3 and 4 to something like 3 and 5, you've increased the margin essentially of the reserves that you would buy. Where now earlier in the process, you're going to have a potential feedback loop of energy and flexible ramping product prices are co-optimized together. And if you're in a position to be going short on flexible ramping product, you know, that sort of scarcity reserve shortage price can find its way into the energy price as well. Now, there's a couple of drawbacks to this, of course, and we'll talk a little bit more about these drawbacks in the upcoming slide. But one obvious one is that, you know, flexible ramping product is a specific product to buy flexible capacity, and there is not necessarily a one-to-one relationship between the lack of flexible capacity and the lack of general capacity. So, for example, you could be in non-tight system conditions and potentially have a lack of flexible capacity to get you, you know, from one interval to the next, even though you have a lot of general capacity there, you know, available to meet your total requirement. You know, you might find yourself in situations where being scarce in flexible capacity is not necessarily the same as being scarce generally in tight system conditions. So, you know, that's one potential drawback of an option like that is that relationship may not be totally harmonious. Let's go back to slide 14 and look at the next option. So another option is to say, well, you can, instead of extending FRP to the right, you can take the procurement curve of your NERC required reserve, like say something like spin or non-spin, which is a contingency reserve product, and buy it in excess of the NERC requirement. So that would look like if we went, can we go back to slide 11? Essentially to say, you know, right now the scarcity reserve demand curve has 5 steps. You can add some more steps to the scarcity reserve demand curve, and you could buy, say, more non-spin than your NERC requirement, more regulation, more spin, whatever, and buy it against, you know, have there be lower steps such that, you know, you are able to sort of relax the procurement of this excess contingency reserve or this excess regulation, which doesn't violate your NERC requirements, but at the same time, through the reserve shortage pricing, you know, creates a price response into the energy price. So that could be an option. Again, another drawback potentially of that option is that specifically for spin and non-spin, those are 10-minute reserve products, and it could be unnecessarily expensive to procure more spin or non-spin because the response time of those reserves is so limited that the pool of resources available to provide those reserves are small, or maybe not small relative to a larger reserve, a slower responding reserve. And so it may be unnecessarily expensive to buy that much more 10-minute reserve. And so we'll look at that too in terms of looking at some of these other ISOs and what kind of products they buy on the right-hand side of the line. That, you know, buying more 10-minute reserves seems like it might be potentially an unnecessarily expensive choice. The other potential drawback of something like that is flexible ramping product is procured in the EIN, in the Western EIN, such that the scarcity price can be valid and activated for all EIN participants. And the spin and non-spin is only procured in the CAISO balancing area. And so, you know, all else equal, it would be desirable to have a solution that can apply symmetrically across the Western EIN as much as possible. So that's another angle to be thinking about. Okay, let's go back to slide 14 and we'll look at the last option. So the last option then could be, well, instead of extending an existing product like FRP or extending an existing product like spin or non-spin, maybe we need either completely something new, either something like a new operating reserve demand curve that buys reserves on a sliding scale, sort of like ERCOT is doing, or some other new reserve product to fit in between non-spin and FRP. So it essentially to say, you know, we take have a whole new reserve product. It's going to be, you know, at some sort of penalty price structure or demand curve structure that fits in between non-spin and flexible ramping product, and can have, you know, a longer reserve response time than non-spin. So you have a larger quantity of reserves or a larger quantity of resources available to supply that product. And so that could be another option as well. So let me do slide 15, and then we'll pause for questions, because I think slide 15 provides some good context here.
Well, real quick. Well, Dan, I saw your hand go up. Dan, we'll come back to you after slide 15 here.
So slide 15, I thought this was really valuable context because it shows for each ISO or each market in the chart what sort of products are on the right of the dashed line. So for let's start with CAISO. CAISO only has the flexible ramping product as sort of an additional reserve product in real time procured above the NERC minimum. And outside of SPP, CAISO and SPP are really the only markets that are not procuring, you know, a reserve in addition to some sort of flex ramp product. So you'll see that MISO has a flex ramp product, but they're also buying 30-minute reserves. All of the Eastern markets are buying 30-minute reserve products. New York, ISO New England, ERCOT has a 30-minute reserve product. PJM has is buying incremental what they're calling spinning reserve or primary reserve. I believe that primary reserves are also have a more relaxed reserve response time than their normal spinning reserve product. So just to show that, you know, in a lot of the other markets, they have, you know, sort of lower reserve type products that they're procuring. And that's why you see back on slide 11, you'll see that their procurement margin is much further to the right than for CAISO and for SPP, is because there's more reserves that they'll buy. Now, each of these reserves comes out of its own sort of penalty price structure, and so there's not, you know, a lot of great harmony in terms of what the actual prices look like and the steps look like for these curves. But in general, it is, you know, not out of the blue to be thinking about, you know, additional reserve product or additional reserve procurement in real-time market relative to what the other ISOs are doing. Okay, so I'll stop there to see take some questions. And the last thing I'll mention is that these are preliminary options. We hope that the working group can weigh in on these options, but also we're very open to other things to consider for discussion today. So please don't think we're limited to just these, you know, preliminary options. But we thought getting something on the table to stimulate discussion was valuable. So I'll stop there.
Thanks for that, James, and reiterating that message, right? I think we have three different things for stakeholders to provide feedback on here today, right? I mean, at the foundational level, we have the problem statement that's presented. You know, we would like your feedback there. Those preliminary options, we're open to new options. We're also open to just considerations that you might need to, or items you feel that might need to be taken into consideration should you agree with one of those options. So looking forward to more engaged discussion here. Callie, I see your hand, but I'm going to go to Dan because he went up and down. We'll go to you right next. If we could please unmute Dan.
Dan Williams from the Energy Authority, and maybe I should have waited until after Callie, but just I put my hand down because I wanted to give James a chance to run through slide 15. But James, I just want to give some positive feedback on how you set up the problem statement and some of the solutions. I think you did get a lot out there that is really front and center, I think, for a lot of us who are participating in this. And certainly the comment that you made about thinking about solutions that are going to be broadly applicable across all of the CAISO's real-time market, and then in the future across the day-ahead market and EDAM as well, I think is just really important given the likely implementation timeline for this, and how soon EDAM is going to be here as part of the market. So I encourage kind of thinking about any of these solutions in that context, so that there can be the kind of stability and competition across the entire footprint that ultimately gives the most efficient outcome, and in sense entities across the entire kind of CAISO market to participate as fully as possible, open up transfers as much as possible, all those sorts of things that are really helpful during tight conditions. Within kind of the solution set, I would like to see maybe discuss just a review of how well the current Order 831 kind of practices are working, as far as when the market is notified of the price caps changing, how well the shaping factor development is working, kind of how well the triggering of the 2000 versus 1000 cap is kind of working within the market. And I think the market results in the EIM over this past weekend with the conditions up here in the Northwest will be a really good kind of post-op for that, to see if having an earlier signal within the day-ahead market of the scarcity conditions that were likely to develop and the pricing conditions that were likely to develop might have helped the footprint as a whole, direct supply to the kind of most needed places. So I'd like to kind of look at some of the Order 831, just kind of policy and practices, holistically as we get into this. And the last thing I want to mention is just kind of to make sure that we're looking at scarcity pricing provisions alongside any changes and helpful things that could come out of fast start pricing and out of the gas resource management projects or efforts that are kind of going on alongside this as well. And just thinking about things like the timeliness of reference level updates and the ability to get in maybe market-based commitment costs, those sorts of things that I think would help bring some rationality to the market prices that then may help the scarcity pricing be better informed when it does kick in, because it would have the most fully accurate kind of LMP basis to be driving off of. So just some thoughts, but overall, I just want to say I really think that the way that you're setting this up and the way you describe these things is very helpful.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate that. And yeah, we'll take back that there's some desire to learn more about how FERC Order 831 is working. That could either come through this working group or potentially in a different sort of market forum. But in light of the conditions over the weekend, it might be a good topic to re-examine. So I appreciate that.
All right, Callie, thanks for your patience. Go ahead and go to Callie Wells, please.
Yeah, hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. No worries at all. Dan, actually, I was going to comment along the same lines as Dan, so that was perfect that he went first. But real quick, before I get into those comments, since you already were on the FERC Order 831, let's maybe see how well that's working. Line of thought, one other thing that I had made note to kind of look into a little bit more and how it's functioning today and whether or not it's a feature that we can consider within this effort is, if I recall correctly, when that was developed and implemented, we could actually be in, and I know we're talking mostly AS shortages right now, but energy shortages before the energy prices actually hit 2000 or reflect 2000. I want to say for CAISO BAA, we can be over a 200 megawatt shortage. There was like a threshold that was implemented in the design to where the energy prices won't, it'll be based off of, I think, the last economic cleared energy bid, even when we're in shortage conditions, before it actually hits that power balance constraint price of 2000. And I think each BAA, including the EIM BAAs, have their own threshold value. So just something that, you know, if you're going to be looking into 831 and how it's performing, that could be a feature I think will be really useful to kind of look into is what those threshold values are and whether or not it's caused an impact on price formation during scarcity conditions.
Yeah, great.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Can I just, yeah. So that's a great observation, and it's something we've noted that's been discussed in the working groups. Not a whole lot of airtime, but we'll have that particular problem statement as a discussion topic for next week, which is, if I can sort of re-summarize what you said, basically that there's not a perfect relationship between supplier costs, which are the trigger for Order 831, penalty prices and bid caps to come into effect, and tight system conditions, which is to say that you're basically saying that you could be in tight system conditions under where you might hope to have some sort of scarcity pricing active to get the right prices for grid reliability, but FERC Order 831 is sort of anchored to a supplier cost, or for CAISO, external costs represented through the hub prices, and that may not always overlap with times where we're in actual tight system conditions. Is that basically what you're getting at?
Kind of. I think maybe my more direct question or issue is, even when we're in FERC Order 831 conditions and the power balance constraint is set at 2000, we could be short energy and our power balance constraint is violated, but the prices that are printing won't actually reflect that $2,000 unless we're more than, and I think for CAISO BA, it's more than 231 megawatts short. So we have to be, that power balance constraint would have to be violated by 232 megawatts, meaning there's 232 megawatts of demand not being served before we actually see that $2,000 energy price. It was kind of like a threshold put in place. So it's just kind of reevaluating that feature of the overall design. But your prior point was also very, something that we'd be interested in looking at, just when we're evaluating how well the FERC Order 831 performances has been.
Got it. Thanks for clarifying. I think I understand your comment.
Yeah, of course. And then back to the potential solutions or options for discussion. I think, these are very interesting ideas to consider. One thing that, as we're talking through these options, something that maybe, I don't know if it's a challenge or a consideration that you guys could take back to the operators when kind of thinking through them, but I do wonder, in the options where you're basically procuring more AS, either spin or non-spin or FRP or some sort of other reserve product, if we're in tight supply conditions and the last few hundred, I'm just going to throw numbers out there, last few hundred megawatts of available supply is now procured by the market and reserved for this additional spin or non-spin, for example, how are operators going to react to that? Are they going to then, is it going to cause them to take additional out-of-market actions that then suppress the prices and almost work in, the opposite impact of what we're trying to do with this effort if that last few hundred megawatts of available energy is actually taken up by the market as another product. Just kind of getting an idea from an operator's perspective, how they would view that outcome, and if that would then, you know, initiate them to take other actions that kind of, you know, crash prices. I know that might be a bit extreme, but, you know, we see that a lot today where out of our market actions end up suppressing prices during these tight supply conditions. So just, I don't know if that's a challenge. I don't know if that's an issue. They might be completely fine with it, but just something that as we're thinking through these options that I think would be useful to think through.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, it should definitely be part of the evaluation of different options, is to think about and to inquire with operators, like what sort of characteristics would make you feel comfortable with, or make you feel most comfortable with. You know, does that mean the characteristics of something like a non-spin? Does that mean the characteristics of something like FRP, or something totally different, like a completely new reserve product? And yeah, I think that's going to be a valuable metric to evaluate, you know, in evaluating the various options.
Yeah, great. Again, it's just something that pops in mind to think through and talk about as we continue evaluating these options. So that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you, Callie. Don, JK, I see your hands, but I want to reflect a question in the chat here, James, maybe for your reaction. I think we need to talk a lot about this new product. The question itself is, if the CAISO added a new product, would it be procured on a zonal or nodal level, and would it be procured on a day ahead or real-time basis?
Yeah, those are good questions, but at this point, it's early to answer those questions. But definitely, if you're looking at whatever solution comes out of this process, those are the types of questions we'd have to answer. So they're on the button, but maybe it's just a little too early to know for sure.
Thanks, Nadia. Yeah, and if you have any, you know, again, we want to stay light on the solutioning and working groups, but I think it's a good conversation starter. So appreciate the comment, Nadia. And if we do go down that road, that's obviously part of the discussion, right? Let's go ahead and move to Don Trethewey, please.
This is Don Trethewey from CISA. Are you able to hear me?
We are Don.
So I wanted to expand more about why the FRP demand curve isn't really scarcity pricing. You know, if you think about the flexible ramping product, it's an insurance policy. So if we talk about like the flexible ramping up, to the extent that you're trying to cover uncertainty that can occur in between intervals, and so to avoid spurious price spikes. And so the way the demand curve set up is basically you would move, and this is for the flexible ramping up, you would move up the energy bid curve by dispatching a higher cost resource if you needed to hold a lower cost resource to provide ramp. And so that's what FRP is getting you. So it's really just how do you manage your ramp capability and your uncertainty on a very short-term basis. It's really not, it's not sending a scarcity signal. It's basically saying what's your willingness to buy the insurance policy or not. And in scarcity, you really want to be sending a signal that I want more supply. And that's not what FRP is intended to do. And then I think if you go down to thinking about using spin or non-spin, I think you run into the key is you want to have that capacity released at some point. And I think you've already highlighted the issues with, you know, for instance, they're holding most spin and non-spin as contingency only, which means it can't actually be released for energy. And they'd have to do, if they were going to release it, they'd have to do something outside of the market. So I think you're really left with implementing some sort of ORDC with, again, as Scott Harvey's always pointed out, sort of a latent supply that's available there. And, you know, I think there's been a lot of talk about I know DMM's brought this up a couple times, like they've been advocating for like a 1 hour reserve product so you could actually buy less imbalance reserves or less FRP. Maybe that's where you can kill two birds with one stone and use that as your latent supply definition, and then use that to implement an ORDC. And that way you keep FRP pure in terms of what it's there to solve. It's that insurance policy against uncertainty, and you buy it whether if the insurance makes sense to buy, you buy it. Keep spin and non-spin clean, and design a really good scarcity pricing mechanism using an ORDC. Thanks.
Thanks, Don. Yeah, good comments there. And on when we get to slide 16, if the information on slide 16 is if the working group finds it valuable, we can work to extend, because slide 16 will talk a little bit about what's the difference between an ORDC and another reserve product, basically, and what are the sort of trade-offs between those design options. And if that sort of thing is the working group finds interesting, we can look to expand more about those types of options in a future working group. So I appreciate that. And yeah, I recognize too, and I think your points on both FRP and non-spin are, the trade-offs or the limitations there are well noted there.
Thank you, Don. Let's go ahead and go to JK.
Hello, this is JK1 from PG&E. Can you hear me?
We can, JK. Go ahead.
Hi. Thank you, James, for the explanation, and thanks, Don, for clarification on why the FRP is not a proper choice. Seems I'm just curious. In the table presented on slide 15, it seems that MISO and SPP are doing the relaxation of FRP in their demand curve. Do you have any insights why they're doing that?
Let's look at, can we go back to slide 11? So let's talk about it. Let's talk about MISO first. And again, next, if I had this chart back, I would zoom in on the, just ignore the left-hand side because it's going to be really hard to see. So bear with me. But MISO's 30-minute reserve demand curve starts way at the bottom. So it's kind of a brownish pink color. And I think the top step of their 30-minute reserve product is like $50 or something like that. So you can kind of see it peeking out there underneath the CAISO's yellow curve. And they buy that 30-minute reserve. And actually just, I think it was actually last year, 2023, they updated the demand curve for that product. Where it was a lower value and they moved it to something like $50 or around there. So that's one step of their demand curve. And then, as I mentioned earlier when explaining this table, it's impossible to see, but their flexible ramping product demand curve is actually like $5 or something like that. And there's no steps. So you can't actually even really see it on this table because it's basically flush with the axis. But those are the steps of their demand curves for those two products. And then SPP is here in green. So their FlexiRamp product, or it's not called FlexiRamp, but it's the equivalent of a FlexiRamp product, starts at their demand curve for that product starts around something similar to where FRP starts. And you can see in green, it's got various steps downward sloping. So hopefully that provides some context of what MISO and SPP are doing with FlexiRamp in their demand curve that are slightly different than CAISO's FlexiRamp curve.
Okay, so are we saying it's because their FlexRamp product is designed differently from the CAISO's FRP, and somehow there is a higher correlation between the ramping scarcity and or their FRP relaxation is not really indicated ramping scarcity, but a capacity scarcity, so it's proper for their market.
Well, the difference, are you saying, what part, so when you're saying it's proper for their market, what part are you talking about is proper?
So I was, referring to what Dan said, an option of including FRP in CAISO's market and extend that yellow curve beyond the red line is improper because our FRP is procured for a different need. And the scarcity of FRP really indicates ramping scarcity instead of capacity scarcity. So it seems like it's not a good choice. But the other market procures or, including FRP in their reserve and design of the demand curve. For what you just explained, I was thinking is that because, their FRP is just defined differently, so they can do that while it's not proper for CAISO.
So a couple things. So flexible ramping product, if you're thinking about our total reserve shortage pricing, flexible ramping product is part of the CAISO's sort of overall reserve shortage pricing, just like it is for SPP and MISO. The difference, for SPP, between SPP and CAISO, there's not a huge amount of difference because a flexi ramp product is the only reserve, the only sort of excess reserve either of those markets are buying. But for MISO, they do have an additional product, the 30-minute reserve that has a relatively low penalty price. And they're buying sort of more reserve relative to the size of their market than the CAISO is and SPP are, with their demand curves. And all we're kind of saying is that, if you want to sort of extend the demand curve for CAISO to the right to be, somewhere closer to where ISO New England and SPJM and New York ISO are, then you either got to do one of three things. You either got to buy more FRP, which we've talked about the limitations of that. You buy more contingency reserve than you need, or you create an entirely new product, or either a new product or an ORDC type function that essentially procures more reserve in real time than relative to what you have. Does that help, or how can I help?
Yeah, I got that. I guess, yeah, we can take this offline. We're just curious why, I understand limitations of including FRP, but I'm just curious why the other RTOs doing that, and if they observe some problem why they're doing that. But I guess we can take that offline. I have a second comment. From what Dan and Kelly and Don just described, I think, one thing I heard and agree is stakeholders desire an equitable treatment of all entities in WEIM in the real-time market. And we do realize there's an asymmetry between the CAISO BA and other EIM entities because, the demand curve only present in the CAISO's BA for the reserves, the operating reserves, and the scarcity pricing accordingly will only appear within the CAISO BA. Of course, there will be interaction, but it seems the application will be limited to the CAISO BA area. So from the three options you just described, it seems the last item has the most potential, realizing the FRP have some limits. The last option has some potential to achieve that equitable treatment, either creating a latent supply curve or creating a 30 minutes, a 30-minute or some, different additional reserves. So that seems to have the most potential to achieve the equitable treatment for all BAs. Now, there's another item I think we haven't discussed yet, but potentially can also achieve that goal is some other market doesn't have, but CAISO or WEM has its RSE test. It does indicate a shortage quite ahead of time and allow the BAs to do different measures accordingly. But we realize, of course, it's different than the demand curve. It does not have the price information. But I was wondering, if we can actually utilize that information and, in combination with existing tools, or, utilize that information separately in order to provide a price signal ahead of time.
Yep. So first, I appreciate your feedback on option number 3, and this is your second comment is something that we haven't really discussed, but another element, as you're pointing out, to evaluating these options are impacts to resource efficiency evaluation. And if you're going to have reserves that are procured across the Western EIM, whether or not those reserves are part of the resource efficiency evaluation, and how existing mechanisms, as you describe, sort of interact with that, is definitely part of what we'll need to think about. Of course, I don't have any answers now, but it's good to get people start thinking about those types of things.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks, JK.
Thank you, JK. Let's go ahead and move to Robert. And Sybil, I see you in the chat. We'll get to you after Robert's hand here.
Hi, this is Robert Fisher from NVE. Would you mind returning to slide 14? Thank you. I kind of want to go through each one of these individually. I think actually all 3 could be implemented or used to make the scarcity pricing work more efficiently. In regards to the FRP, it may not have been designed as a scarcity product. And I emphasize design, the current design, because it is implemented in a series with AS, where the demand curve is set below the AS demand curve. And it is different from that because it has an opportunity curve. So the opportunity aspect on the energy doesn't always set it, because you may have high priced bids where there's no opportunity cost where you can have those products be procured from. So there could be adjustments made with the FRP to help better align it with a scarcity product where the opportunity cost better reflects a price in a shortage condition. Along with that, there tends to be this FRP is used in the EIM, but there tends to be lines within the procurement of the EIM where it is deliverable to certain areas but not to others. So this could also help reflect those scarcity conditions if those cut planes are better defined. Along with that, I think the operating reserve for the second bullet is also a very feasible idea. The problem with the operators using this is no longer going to happen if you have a curve past the NERC requirement, because as long as they are maintaining their NERC requirement, they will not be using or adjusting the operating reserves past that point, and it would be a good condition. And to just kind of throw that out there, I mean, we're in the land of EDAM right now. This could also be used possibly in the EDAM EIM type situation. And for the last point, I think this is a good point for something you brought up earlier, James, for operator action. We need some kind of mechanism to represent operator actions. And I think the possibility of using an ORDC and say an EEA watch or an EEA1 or EEA2 type situation could be useful for help defining scarcity conditions.
Thanks, Robert. Yes, that's all good feedback, all good things for us to consider. I think, yeah, all of these, and one thing that you mentioned is that the overall solution could be bits and pieces of a little bit of all of these options. And we should, do our due diligence to identify sort of the pros and cons between them, and try to, potentially even pick out a couple of things that we could do. For example, you could go with something like option 3, but that doesn't preclude you from making some improvements to the FRP demand curve if that you know, warrants it. So
yeah, I think the FRP demand curve and everything around FRP is going to eventually evolve anyway. Might as well use it under this circumstance to help get some two benefits with a little bit of scarcity and a little bit of ramp product. Thank you.
I'd like to, so Sybil, I know I mentioned we'd go right back to you after that comment, but I'd like to see if there's any reaction to Robert's comments there and really kind of what James also outlined of, you know, these are not simply proposed solutions, but you know, there's the ability to kind of cherry pick. I'm just going to open it up if there's any reaction to any of the comments Robert made there. Okay, well let's go to Sybil here. James, could you speak to how this would look with imbalanced reserve product, and wouldn't that add a category under this discussion?
yeah, so the reason why imbalanced reserve is not on that chart is because these are real-time. This is a real-time reserve curve, and so you could make a similar curve in the day-ahead market that would have imbalanced reserve on it and not FRP. Generally speaking, scarcity pricing is a real-time market phenomenon. That's not always true, of course, but you know, when we're talking about prices rising gradually in advance of a shortage condition, normally those are price responses that you would see in the real-time market. So good observation, but yeah, this is a real-time market curve and not a day-ahead market curve.
Let's go ahead and unmute Sybil here, please.
Thanks. I just taking it to some of the broader discussion. I wonder if there's a comparison between the like version of the day ahead curves and the real-time curves that can tell us a little bit about some of the discrepancies that have been discussed sort of under the broader discussion that we've been having around, you know, consistency of the price signals. And then also to the prior comment, in terms of improving the price signal for FRP, we've been interested in understanding also if that may be something to consider maybe as an alternative to fast start pricing. And so just noting that exploration of that may have broader implications under other portions of the price formation initiative. Thanks.
Yeah, a good reminder on the FRP. There are some potential ideas to sort of, you know, has been brought up, enhance FRP in certain ways that make either the scarcity price signal stronger or other sort of price formation improvements outside of scarcity pricing as well.
Thanks for those comments, Sybil. Let's go ahead and move to Dan Williams, please.
It's Dan from DEA. So just wanted to kind of support what Sybil was saying about kind of, or maybe taking it a little bit different direction, but just on the thinking about the new imbalance reserve products and to an extent reliability capacity products as well. At you know, with EDAM in front of us and not that far away, and these new products coming in, you know, it is an opportunity to just kind of to look at how those may help inform, you know, having sort of maximal latent reserves or latent supply available in the market to the extent that the tighter conditions can be identified you know, even before the day ahead market run, since that's where, you know, we're going to need to get as many, you know, bids in as possible, as much bid range as possible into the market, both in the CAISO BAs and the EDAM BAs, you know, to pass the day ahead resource sufficiency, but, you know, more specifically to get the most efficient unit commitment. And there's been links made by kind of CAISO DMM going back to kind of before the EDAM stakeholder process wrapped up around the need to maybe look at when imbalance reserves come in at pulling forward the flexible ramping product, kind of look ahead to be able to use those imbalance reserves most, I don't know, effectively. So, maybe there is something there in if we're looking at flexible ramping product and how that ties into scarcity pricing to kind of revisit some of those comments on would we feel differently about what we can get out of flexible ramping product if it was being done a little bit further in advance of the operating hour? How would any of those things change how we're looking at this? So, the last thing and maybe tie in there is just the need to maybe take another look at Order 831 and some of the triggers for the changes in the price cap. That tying that in with the changes that are coming in EDAM would be useful as well. And I didn't really mention that before, but kind of the whole goal here is something we talked about in the last meeting, that we aren't just trying to get scarcity pricing to get sort of these like needle peak high price events during real time. The goal of it is to be able to predict where prices are going to go in real time so that you can get the right unit commitment day ahead. And as you get that unit commitment more right more often, to have that reflected back into forward contracting to get kind of the least cost solution on a societal basis long term. And it's that kind of like peeling back further and further. The more accurate prices you have in real time, just the more efficient things can get going further and further back into the decision process. So just a few more things there to that kind of Sybil's mentioning of kind of the things changing in EDAM, reminded me I wanted to kind of get out on the table too.
Thanks, Dan.
All right, thank you, everybody. James, I don't mean to keep interrupting your the presentation here. I know we have stakeholder feedback, but sometimes while it's fresh in mind and right in front of us with the slide. So let's go ahead. No hands, no questions in chat. Let's toss it back to you, and if we could move to slide 16, please.
Great. Yeah, and this is the last slide of the presentation, and this is a table I took from the report, an EFRI report, but the title of that report is in the title of the slide. And I apologize that we don't try to make a habit of putting information out on reports that are not accessible to the public. But sometimes where you have information that is too valuable not to share, we are able to share this particular slide, even though I don't have a link to the actual report. But it's more or less just to get a sort of framework and discussion about what we talked about in the last slide in terms of option 3, to the pros and cons between, in this case, flexible reserve, you can think of in our context as meaning like an additional reserve product, whereas on the right-hand side, an operational reserve demand curve is something a little bit different, where it's not, a specific reserve product per se, but general procurement of sort of latent supply as it relates to scarcity pricing. And we can, if this is something that's interesting to the working group, we can build upon this and give more, on the ground examples about, the difference between these things. But I just wanted to highlight a couple of differences as it's stated in this chart. One of them is in terms of a reserve product. Reserve products can be a little bit more tailored to the specific types of flexibility or reserve requirements that you need. we talked a little bit about earlier that, you know, one of the criteria with which to evaluate different options is to, you know, identify what types of characteristics of a reserve product are most useful in order to sort of meet the gap between the contingency reserve and the FRP. Now that tailoring does provide for, you know, getting to the unique aspects of what you need, but at the same time, the tailoring also is sort of a con in a sense that it can be difficult to arrive at a really a solution that you know is perfect for the conditions with which you're looking at, and so the broadness of an operational reserve demand curve may be desirable from that perspective as well. If you have different certain types of resource characteristics or resource types that you want to be able to provide the product, you know, a reserve product might be better suited. If you're open to more general provision of energy or reserves from various resources, operational reserve demand curve could be something. You could also be thinking about operational reserve demand curve in terms of provision of supply on the interties, where generally speaking, contingency reserve products, at least for the CAISO balancing area, aren't normally procured outside of the CAISO balancing area. But you could have a sort of a larger swath of resource potentially eligible to provide supply that would fit the operational reserve demand curve over the specific reserve product. In terms of flexible reserve, one of the things to think about is how ramp sharing works. And so in some markets, they have this concept of ramp sharing where, for example, the ramp that's provided in a 30-minute reserve can go to support, or the ramp that's provided in a flexible ramp product or short-term reserve can meet the the ramp requirement for a 30-minute reserve product. And so do you allow for sort of the sharing of ramp between products or not? And then there's also, in terms of another reserve product, you know, complexity in terms of computation. And so, you know, if you were looking at something like, you know, another reserve product that's subject to a deliverability test, like a deployment scenario, you know, what that does to, you know, computational complexity relative to what an ORDC could provide, something that's a little more broad. So, in any way, feel free to dig through this a little bit, and we can follow up with this information in a future discussion. But I would summarize this table to say that a new reserve product offers more in terms of tailoring to specific needs, but its trade-offs are in the details, right? That coming up with those details can be difficult, and also in terms of the complexity in the market itself, market software itself, where an ORDC is a little bit more broad. Maybe not, it's not quite as tailored to the unique circumstances that you need additional reserves in, but it may be more broadly applicable in terms of the resources that can provide or meet supply on the demand curve and the resource characteristics, and it may be a little bit more computationally easy relative to the new reserve product. And because there are not as many tailored details, it might just be easier in terms of overall factors to think about when looking at that market design. So just thought I'd throw this slide out there for some information and some discussion. So we can certainly follow up if there seems to be some interest in this sort of thing. So we can look at ways to sort of expand what the differences are between these two products. And of course, if you have access to FRE products, feel free to find the full and read the full report, which is also good background information.
Any questions on for James here? James, I'm not seeing any hands. Dan, appreciate you sharing a couple articles there in the chat. Not seeing any questions in the chat either. James, thank you very much. Great presentation as was last time. So really appreciate the discussion that you led here with our stakeholders today in both sprint sessions 1 and 2. James, if I could ask you to come back, I think the one thing I'll ask of you to kind of tease out, we talked a little bit about, we kind of signaled next week's problem statements, or at least one of the problem statements that, we've been talking here about sprint number 3 being kind of a collection of several problem statements. We heard a little bit about out of market actions. I wanted to kind of toss it to you for perhaps a little preview or teaser on what we will be discussing as far as problem statements next week.
Sure, and I want to point out in the Dan has provided some good information in the chat. Please take a look at that. I have listened to that Jacob Mays podcast in Public Power Underground, and I can recommend that. So listen to that on your way to and from work. It's very interesting. And then Dan has also linked a paper from Jacob Mays is a professor at Cornell, and he's got Dan's linked a paper that might be interesting. I'm not sure I've looked at that paper, but do feel free to use those. For sprint number 3, so sprint number 1 and 2 were sort of easy in the sense that, at least in my mind, I'm not sure in anybody else's mind, but the problem statements were a little bit more discrete in terms of, like, I used the left of the red dashed line in that chart and right of the red dashed line in the chart. That's sort of the distinguish between the two problem statements. And sprint number 3 is sort of a collection of other types of problem statements that I will, I think, kind of even go beyond scarcity pricing, in the sense that I would just say other sort of ideas brought up in the working group that are relevant to price formation under tight system conditions. So it may not be scarcity pricing the way scarcity is traditionally defined, as we discussed in this working group, but it can be about, things related to FERC Order 831 and things related to storage bidding that are relevant to price formation under tight system conditions that the working group should discuss. And the intention of that sprint is to sort of make sure we have a full record and catalog of the issues that we've discussed under this working group. And once we have that catalog, sort of fully represented, we can begin to, in this working group, prioritize the problem statements that we should pursue, and also to identify for each problem statement where entities are feeling like more information is needed that the CAISO can provide to get stakeholders on board with transitioning more into ideas for solutions to those problem statements. So I think that's the best way I can summarize what the discussion will look like next week in context of the where we're at in the sprint.
I appreciate that, James. Thank you. And on that note, if we could move back to slide 12 for just a moment, because James, I think, captured a pretty important part of the working group process. And so I don't want to assume anything. So I just wanted to kind of go back. I mentioned there were there's a foundational topic. There's 3 things for us to discuss today. There's this problem statement here, and as James mentioned, we do want to make sure that we're capturing, everybody's thoughts. So let's take this back to the price formation enhancements. I think it was working group session 2. We're on working group session 11 at this point here. But you know, is there anyone who we went into kind of potential things to consider? Why is this a problem? Preliminary options as far as solutions go. So let me ask it this way: is there anybody who would like to speak up here in the community that feels like this is not a problem statement that should be included in that prioritization effort, or that there are you know, other considerations, or that it should be amended in any way to lead into that problem statement prioritization conversation a little bit later in the process? You guys are taking it, all right, taking it easy on us, but I think we're diving in, and I'm hearing some pretty good consensus on this problem statement, at least from the discussions that we had here today. Dan, I see your hand up. Thank you for that, sir. Let's go ahead and unmute Dan.
Yeah, it's Dan at T. I don't think there's anything wrong with the problem statement, but it does kind of stop short of the why. You know, kind of you know, why do we want to have you know, prices gradually rise in front of demand shortfalls? Like, what are we trying to get out of this? So maybe folks can just go back and, you know, kind of consider, like, does that need to be expanded a little bit to drive towards that goal of kind of overall greater market efficiency, reliability, those sorts of things. And it's been a while since that meeting, so it's I may not be remembering some of the context of the problem statement, but that just occurred to me when looking at it in isolation.
Oh no, absolutely, Dan. I appreciate it. And that's why we posted it up there for us to put it there in isolation, right? For you to take a look at. I was more citing, you know, us going back to just making sure we were in line with problem statements. And I think the why is that a problem, you know, really open to the community's feedback there. You know, we're doing this sprint to kind of have this conversation regain some momentum. I think it definitely has. We really appreciate everybody's very active engagement here in the last two sessions. Looking forward to that continuing in the third session. But with that rapid succession, or with these sprints being, you know, 1 week in between each other, we're not asking for any kind of comments in between. We don't want to put that in that expectation or that turnaround on you as far as stakeholder bandwidth goes. But I would echo what Dan says. You know, reviewed these whys. The whys are incredibly important in that problem statement conversation. They shape you know, the potential solutions that we're looking forward to hearing from you guys on. So at the end of sprint number 3, we will have a comment template to capture feedback on all 3 sessions. And again, I want to reiterate, if there is anything that, as you kind of go through your week, that you think of, we want this to marinate, we have this information out in front of you here. We will also provide some time in sprint number 3 to go back, review the conversation to date in that sprint, and we'll be able to take any additional comment there. Okay, any other comments on either the problem statement or perhaps this why? Or I think we had a pretty good discussion on slide 14 on the preliminary options. And again, want to reiterate, these are meant as conversation starters for you to either comment upon or to present another option for consideration, as we did earlier today. Okay, at this point, I'm going to go ahead. If we could go to slide 19, and Isabella, I will turn this back over to you to close us out. Thank you very much for the great conversation today, everybody.
Thanks, Juan, and thanks, James, for your presentation today as well. So as we look at next steps, the next upcoming working group session, as James kind of previewed with us a few minutes ago, is next week on the 24th, and that will be another virtual session from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. And you can also reference the working group schedule that's posted on the Price Formation Enhancements webpage for the complete schedule as well. And then on this slide here, we just have some additional reference links. So a link out to the initiative webpage, a link to the working group schedule. And then if you do have any questions, please contact Brenda Corona, and her email is listed here on this slide. Or you can send an email to the Stakeholder Affairs inbox, and that email is also listed for you on this slide as well. And then just before we wrap up, just wanted to share with you all the recent news release that the ISO published regarding the FERC acceptance of the ISO's tariff changes for Western day-ahead electricity market. So if you haven't checked out that news release, I encourage you to do so. There's a direct link for you here on this slide, and you're also able to access it on the CAISO website. And then in addition, we do have an Energy Matters blog that we post to regularly, and it provides timely insights into the ISO grid and market operations, as well as some other industry related news. So if you haven't checked out the Energy Matters blog, I encourage you to take a look at that as well. So there's a direct link to that blog here on this slide for you too. But with that, that wraps up today's working group meeting. Thank you all for your participation today, and have a great rest of your afternoon.